The unknown. What are the people like? Ah, the shape of things.
In 1960, a film sent its hero racing into the far future and brought him home with hope. But the man who first dreamed that journey, H.G. Wells, had seen something very different waiting at the end of time. And the darkest thing he ever wrote is the one part the film refused to show you. The Time Machine, George Pal's 1960 classic, is remembered as a warm adventure. A Victorian inventor, the gentle Eloi, the monstrous Morlocks, and an Oscar-winning effect that raced the whole world past a single window. But behind that hopeful film sits a string of strange, true stories. In ending, Wells wrote that the film couldn't bring itself to show. A nuclear war that wasn't in the book, a lava flow made of breakfast cereal, and a time machine that genuinely vanished for years. We're gonna walk through them one by one, and unlike the usual versions of this story online, every single one of them is real. This is the missing frame of the time machine. Number 1, the ending Wells wrote that the film refused to show. In George Pal's film, the inventor stops in the year 802,701, frees the Eloi from the cannibal Morlocks, and heads back to the future to rebuild hopeful, human warmth. But that is not where Wells left his time traveler. In the original 1895 novel, the traveler climbs back onto his machine and pushes the lever far, far further to a dying Earth tens of millions of years from now. The planet is slowed almost to a stop. A swollen red sun hangs cold and motionless in the sky. The beaches are silent, and the only things still moving are enormous crab-like creatures dragging themselves across a dead shore. And in the novel, the traveler pushes on even further still into a deep eclipse some 30 million years from now, where the last living thing he can see is a single round, black shape flopping feebly on a blood-red sandbank, before the cold and the terrible silence finally drive him home. It is one of the bleakest and strangely most beautiful passages in all of science fiction. Pal knew it by his own account. He wanted to film it, the journey to the age when the crabs inherit the Earth, and then he cut it because it simply didn't fit the hopeful film he was making. And here is the honest part. The clone channels get wrong. This was planned and dropped, not filmed and hidden. There is no lost reel of the dying world. There is a vision the film chose to look away from. Number 2, the nuclear war that wasn't in the book. Wells wrote his novel in 1895, imagining humanity drifting slowly apart over hundreds of thousands of years. But Pal's film, made at the height of the Cold War, added something Wells never could have: the bomb. As the inventor travels forward, he doesn't simply pass through time. He stops in 1917 and again during the Blitz, and finally in a near-future war that ends in an atomic firestorm, the lava swallowing London only a few years ahead of the 1960 audience watching. To a crowd living under the shadow of the hydrogen bomb, that wasn't fantasy. It was a warning dressed as a fairy tale. The film took Wells's quiet meditation on class and decay and turned it into something sharper and more frightening. A story about a civilization that destroys itself and what crawls out of the ruins. Hedge the exact near-future year the film places its devastating war just ahead of its own audience, often cited as 1966. Number 3, the savage warning hidden under the adventure. The gentle, childlike Eloi who live in the sunlight, and the pale Morlocks who live below, they aren't just monsters and victims. Wells built them as a brutal vision of where comfort and inequality might lead. The descendants of the leisured rich, grown beautiful and useless, and the descendants of the working class, driven underground for generations until they turned on the very people they once served. In the novel, the horror lands slowly the dawning realization that the Morlocks don't merely serve the Eloi, they farm them and eat them. The 1960 film keeps that nightmare, but tidies it into a clear fight between good and evil, with a hero to root for. It does keep Wells's haunting furniture, though the exact year 802,701, the great brooding sphinx that watches over the Eloi's meadow. The round wells the Morlocks climb down into the dark. Wells wasn't writing about good and evil at all. He He was writing about us and about what we might become if we let the gap between comfort and labor widen far enough for long enough. Number 4, the man who built the future by hand. To bring it to the screen, MGM turned to George Pal, a Hungarian-born showman who had practically launched the golden age of Hollywood science fiction Destination Moon, When Worlds Collide, and an earlier Wells adaptation, The War of the Worlds. Pal believed in building his futures physically, in front of the camera, rather than merely talking about them. He had begun in stop-motion animation, and he never lost the craftsman's instinct to make the impossible by hand. Hollywood had already handed him a Special Academy Award years before for the inventive Puppetoon shorts that made his name. For The Time Machine, he surrounded himself with effectsmen who thought the same way, and together they produced a vision of the future so convincing that, more than 60 years on, it still holds up. To Pal, science fiction wasn't a cheap thrill. It was a way of asking serious questions about where the human race was going, and he was not at all sure the answer was good. Number 5, the lava made of breakfast cereal. The Time Machine won its Academy Award for special effects, and the men behind them, Wah Chang and Gene Warren, pulled off their wonders with almost no money and a great deal of ingenuity. Working under the banner of a small effects house called Project Unlimited, they treated every shot as a problem to be solved by hand. The river of molten lava that pours through London during the nuclear war, oatmeal dyed red and lit to glow, the mannequin in the shop window across the street, whose dress silently changes with the fashions as the years tear past, hand-swapped, frame by frame, in stop motion. And the centerpiece, the world racing by outside the machine, the sun streaking across the sky, snails crawling at lightning speed, a candle burning down in a heartbeat, a flower blooming and dying in an instant was all achieved in painstaking time-lapse, long before any computer could fake it. The effect still works today for one simple reason. It was real, photographed in a camera, one frame at a time. Number 6, the editor Alfred Hitchcock trusted. Pal handed the finished film to a serious craftsman to cut, George Tomasini. Regular viewers of this channel will recognize that name. Tomasini was Hitchcock's editor. He cut Vertigo, Psycho, and North by Northwest, which we have covered on this channel. In 1960 alone, the same year The Time Machine reached cinemas, Tomasini was also cutting Psycho, quietly assembling two of the most famous films of the year at once. The Time Machine sits right in the middle of that extraordinary run, and that tells you something important. This was not a disposable monster picture knocked out by hacks. It was shaped by one of the finest editors in Hollywood. The man Hitchcock trusted with some of the most precisely cut films ever made. The craft you feel in The Time Machine, the way it carries you so smoothly from a cozy Victorian parlor to the literal end of the world, is no accident at all. Number 7, the 3 books that were never named. The film gives George a hopeful ending the novel never offered. He returns to his own time, tells his astonished friends what he has seen, and then sets off again into the future to help the Eloi rebuild the civilization from nothing, taking with him 3 books from his own library. The film never tells us which 3. His friend Philby is left staring at the gap on the shelf, wondering aloud which 3 books a man would choose to begin the world again. It is a small, quietly beautiful, open question the kind audiences have argued over for 60 years. And it is entirely an invention of the film. Wells gave his traveler no such hopeful errand. In the novel, he simply vanishes and never returns. The 3 books are Hollywood's gift to a story that, on the page, ended in the dark. Number 8, the hero is secretly the author. Watch closely and you'll catch a quiet joke the film never points out. Rod Taylor's inventor is known to his friends only as George, but the plaque on the Time Machine itself reads that it was manufactured by H. George Wells. The time traveler, who is left unnamed in the novel, has quietly been turned into Herbert George Wells, the very man who dreamed him up. The author climbs into his own invention and rides it to the end of the world. Opposite Taylor, as the gentle Eloi girl Weena, the film cast a young and almost unknown Yvette Mimieux. This was one of her very first roles. She was so new that the production reportedly kept a careful eye on her inexperience, and the film that sent a man to the end of time helped launch a career at the very start of one. Number 9. The Rings That Remembered. When George reaches the world of the Eloi, he finds the last fragments of human knowledge in a ruined museum, the Palace of Green Porcelain. There, among the dust and decay, are the talking rings, spinning discs that still carry recorded human voices, telling of the long, ruinous war that finally broke civilization and drove one branch of humanity underground. It is an eerie, melancholy idea that after hundreds of thousands of years, all that survives of human history is a handful of records that nobody left alive can even understand. The gentle Eloi had long forgotten how to read. The rings were the last thing on Earth still trying to tell them the truth about themselves. Those recorded voices were supplied by Paul Frees, one of Hollywood's great unseen voice actors, the man behind countless characters you've heard but never seen. Number 10. A Tune from the Wrong Century. The score came from Russell Garcia, all sweeping strings and shimmering menace, carrying the audience from a cozy Victorian parlor all the way to the end of the world. But listen carefully to the film's final, gentle moments, the quiet exchange between the housekeeper and Philby after George has gone, and you'll hear a piece of music that, strictly speaking, shouldn't be there at all. Claude Debussy's The Girl with the Flaxen Hair. It's a lovely choice, and a curious one, because Debussy composed it some years after the film's turn-of-the-century setting. A small anachronism slipped into a film obsessed with time itself, a piece of music quietly traveling backwards to a moment it could not yet have existed in. Whether it was a deliberate joke or a happy accident, it fits the story perfectly. Number 11. The Machine That Vanished. There is one last disappearance in this story, and it happened in real life. The beautiful brass and velvet time machine prop survived the production and then, fittingly, slipped out of its own time. In 1970, MGM auctioned off its history in a single, enormous sale, the same legendary auction that sold off Dorothy's ruby slippers. The time machine went to the owner of a traveling show, and then it simply disappeared. About 5 years later, a friend of the film historian Bob Burns spotted it, of all places, in a thrift shop in Orange, California, battered, its chair and controls long gone, but unmistakable. Burns bought what was left for around $1,000 and, using the original blueprints George Pal had once handed him, rebuilt it from the wreck with a crew of friends. The most famous time machine in cinema had drifted, lost for more than a decade, and only just made it home. Restored, it went on to a strange second life. It turned up in Carl Sagan's Cosmos and in the film Gremlins, and in 1993, it carried Rod Taylor himself back one last time in a short reunion film written by the original screenwriter, with Taylor and his old co-star Alan Young stepping back into their roles after more than 30 years. The machine, like the story, refused to stay in the past. Number 12, The Great-Grandson Who Tried Again. There is a strange symmetry to how this story ends. In 2002, Hollywood remade The Time Machine once more, and the director they chose was a British filmmaker named Simon Wells. The surname is no coincidence. Simon Wells is the great-grandson of H.G. Wells himself, the man who invented the time machine on paper more than a century earlier. So the family that first imagined traveling through time finally got to send one of its own back to the beginning to tell the story again. The 2002 film even slipped in a quiet bridge of its own, a small cameo by Alan Young, the very actor who had played George's loyal friend Philby back in 1960. The remake itself is largely forgotten now, but the image at its heart, a man building a machine to outrun his own grief and finding a future he never wanted, is pure Wells. Some stories, it seems, keep quietly pulling their own descendants back toward them. 12 true stories. Behind a film most people remember only as a hopeful adventure, The Time Machine endures because of its warmth, its craft, and that lovely unanswered question about the 3 books. But it endures too because of the darkness pressing at its edges, the burning cities, the human cattle, and the dying world Wells saw waiting at the end of time. The film chose comfort over despair, and it was probably right to. The man who dreamed it up never gave himself that choice. That is the real missing frame of the time machine, not a reel lost in a vault, but a vision of the end of everything that the film looked straight at, and then, gently, decided to spare us.